Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Susan Yuqing Feng, Director Program at China Institute in America. Thanks, everyone, for coming here. China Institute is almost a 100 years institution. Actually, next year, it's our 100 years anniversary. During the past 100 years, our mission is, it's not easy. During the past 100 years, our mission is to help U.S. to understand China better, is to promote the relationship between the two great nations. And I found that this mission is more important than ever, and the discussion here is more relevant than ever. We have only 2 months, no more than 2 months into Trump administration, yet we have almost witnessed daily based shock and awe moments, right? Everyone, wake up in the morning, wow, yeah, things happened again, right? And President Trump called himself a tariff man, using tariff as a weapon to press both allies and rebels. But fears of trade war and sense of slowing growth and possible of recession is starting to shake confidence. We see yesterday the market dropped almost 1,000 points, and today almost 500 points. So we are in a period of chaos and uncertainty. To help us make sense of it all, today we have 2 outstanding speakers who will share their insights with us, and now they will tell us what's really happening and what might come next. So welcome. First, let me introduce Craig Allen. Craig Allen is a senior counselor at the Cohen Group in Washington, D.C., and Ambassador Allen was former president of U.S. China Business Council. In this role, he's been here for 6 years, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Craig involved a lot of U.S. Policy to China and have first-hand experience on multinational doing business in China. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next our speaker is Brad Setzer. Brad is a very established scholar on trade, especially on U.S.-China trade relations. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome. Today, the news is that this morning is Trump said, he will impose 50% tariff on Canada. And just now, when I check the message, it's just off again. So we kind of think about the tariff, 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada just a week ago. So it seems, Brad, help us understand, is tariff, what's the goal of this? This tariff itself is a goal, or it's a tool to achieve something even bigger?
Okay, Susan is nodding at me, so I'm happy to say a few words. I do think that we should understand what the administration is trying to achieve. And the new United States Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, published the president's trade policy a few days ago. And I think it's worthwhile because we need to put ourselves into their shoes and understand what they're thinking. And so I have a copy of the president's trade policy here, and I will summarize that the tariff policy is one of the tools that the administration is using to bring back manufacturing to the United States. That is the stated goal. And tariffs are one, but only one, of the ways that they are trying to do that. And in the president's trade agenda for 2025, Ambassador Greer states that a production economy is a high-wage economy. A production economy creates jobs for all. A production economy is a boon for innovation, and a production economy is a vital component of our national defense. So I think that a representative of the administration were here, that is what they would emphasize. Along with tariffs, there are a good number of other policies that the administration is using to try to achieve the same goal. And that would be decreasing taxes, decreasing regulation, and working on foreign direct, to encourage foreign direct investment in manufacturing. If you're to kind of look more deeply at the tariff component, I think that a scholar by the name of Doug Irwin, he's literally written the book on this, and highly recommend his writing and thinking. And but he notes that tariffs have in general, three different types of purposes. One is revenue, and President Trump has said that he'd like to set up a Department of External Revenue. Tariffs can also be used as retribution, and I think that we've seen a number of examples of that, which we could talk about. But tariffs could also be used as reciprocity, or to encourage other countries to lower their tariffs or non-tariff barriers. And I think that that's a useful framework to look at the president's policies, that they're to raise revenue, that they are retribution for perceived harms, and that they are to encourage greater openness to American exports. So I think that an administration spokesperson would highlight the wonderful benefits that you're seeing or will see from tariffs. I'm not sure I would accept that thinking, but I think that we need to understand this from their perspective if we want a well-grounded conversation.
Yeah. Craig, you mentioned that the three goals of tariff. I can see that when dealing with Mexican, the goals is like to force Mexican to stop the decrease the production of fentanyl, and it works. I just saw a piece on New York Times that the production in Mexico dropped significantly after Trump threatened the tariff. So, Brad, I want to ask you, the goal of this to Mexico is different from the tariff goal to China, right? So what's the goal? What's the goal to have increased tariff on China? Well, is it different from increase from the goal to Canada and Mexico?
Look, I am less diplomatic than Craig. I don't think the goals that this administration has set out are clear yet. There's obviously tensions. There's obviously contradictions. If you follow their own rhetoric, we are just actually getting started.
Yes.
These are the appetizers, so to speak. The main course perhaps comes on April 2nd with the reciprocal tariffs, or perhaps it gets delayed and pushed beyond. So what we, in a sense, have seen are the easiest tariffs to legally introduce at the president's discretion.
Okay.
And the easiest tool, the one that has the least requirements for setting out your actual policy, your actual remedy, is to act under the President's Emergency Authority, International Economic Emergencies Act, IEEPA. So what fentanyl to me is less the real reason and a little bit more the pretext. Why do I say that? Because there was really no fentanyl coming from Canada.
No, yeah.
Yet most of the president's rhetoric has been directed at Canada.
Why?
I mean, apparently they don't want to become the 51st state. I mean, it's a joke, but it's not a joke because he tweets it. I mean, technically Truth Socials it. So, I mean, on one level, if you are setting out as a negotiating goal, asking your northern neighbor to give up its independence,
Yeah.
you are setting yourselves up to fight a trade war with your northern neighbor. Not a trade war with China. You may fight a second trade war with China, but at no point has President Trump suggested that he wants China to be the 52nd state. And I think confident he won't. Hard to jump Greenland. So until there's a little bit more clarity about the goal,
Okay.
I think it is hard to know. The other goal he has set out, which you know, with the reciprocal tariffs, I mean, amongst the many different goals, one goal is he wants U.S. tariffs to match other countries' tariffs. Yet in the framing of the reciprocal tariffs, President Trump has included other countries' value-added taxes as a trade barrier that impedes American exports and national sales taxes and other things. Most economists, myself included, do not think a value-added tax is discriminatory and therefore don't think it is analogous to a tariff. A tariff impacts foreign imports, it doesn't impact domestic production. A value-added tax done well applies to everyone. But if you set out as your goal to counterbalance the impact of other countries' value-added taxes because you think they are an impediment to your exports, you're setting out a path that leads to tariffs. Because other countries rely on the VAT for revenue. They can't give up their revenue base. Europe actually needs to spend more on defense. I think everyone, Europe included, agrees on that. Certainly President Trump
But
thinks
do you
so.
think President Trump has a point that he said that, you know, it's not now. When he was a businessman, he always felt that it's unfair for United States to have this free trade because, you know, United States charge most of country only 3% of tax. But most countries charge much more, like EU charge United States 5 to 7%, and developing country even more. Do you think President Trump has a point to say that U.S. want to have the, you know, same kind of treatment of the tariff?
Yes and no. The no bit is that if you define value-added taxes as a trade barrier, you are not...
Could you explain us value-added tax?
A value-added tax is basically a national sales tax. It's calculated a bit differently. But in Europe, in general, about 20% of the value of all purchases is collected as a consumption tax. It's a tax on consumption. It is collected in a fancier way, so it's harder to avoid. Point being, it's not a tariff.
Okay.
And if you put tariffs on that are equal to other countries' value-added taxes, we will have much higher tariffs than our trading partners. No one outside the U.S. will say that is reciprocal. Where I also think Trump doesn't really have a point, and I'll get to where I think he does have a point, is actually most global trade is done at a tariff of 0. Over half of all industrial goods have no tariffs. Pharmaceuticals, most electronics. The WTO-bound tariff across a wide range of goods trade is 0. There are specific tariffs in specific goods, and some of those are a little bit different. Europe has a 10% tariff on autos. We have a 2.5% tariff on autos, unless it's a light truck, in which case it's 25. Actually, that 25 tariff has a pretty big impact on trade. There's a range of those kinds of discrepancies. The global trading regime was built on a principle which is many people find counterintuitive, which more or less is as follows. We will set out a uniform tariff on autos that will apply to anything that is called an auto, and we will tariff it at a common rate. That way we don't have to really spend much time worrying if it's from the EU or for Japan. You don't have to define rules of origin. It is just an auto, and if it is an auto, it's tariffed at that rate, independent of how other countries tariff autos. Now, if you have a free trade agreement, you can bring it to 0, and then you have to have rules of origin. Now, Trump's argument, which has an element of truth, is that over time, U.S. tariffs became quite low, and many emerging economies entered into the WTO at much higher levels of tariffs. China is certainly one. India is certainly another. Brazil is another. I note this because some of these countries have big surpluses and some don't. Tariffs don't actually determine your trade balance as a general matter. But there is a truth to the argument that before Trump, many other countries had higher tariffs than the U.S. And so there is some basis for thinking that maybe it would be a good idea if some other countries brought their tariffs down. Fair enough. What I don't think has a strong basis is arguing that other countries' value-added taxes, to go back to this, because it's the biggest of the possible reciprocal tariffs, are themselves tariffs. And so we are going to suddenly go from having generally low tariffs to possibly 20 or 25% tariffs on everyone, not just Canada and Mexico, on April 3rd. That's the real uncertainty.
Yeah, to the point that, we can go back a little bit to about the international trade system, but now let's just focus on the trade to China. Trump has added 20% tariff on about $440 billion worth of Chinese imports. Right now, the tariff on Chinese goods is around 39%. Everyone know how much is the tariff around 2018? It's no more than 3%. Such big increase. So just now you mentioned that this is just appetizer. Do you think Trump will increase tariff to China 60% as he promised?
Let me say a couple things. Firstly, the tariffs are not going to determine whether or not you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. They're irrelevant to that. What will determine your current account or your trade balance is the relationship between domestic savings and domestic consumption. Too much savings, you have a trade surplus. Too much consumption, you have a trade deficit. Period, full stop, end of story, always. And in the case of the United States, we don't have enough savings. And in the case of China, there's far too many savings. And that's why we have a trade deficit. And tariffs might shift around the composition of the trade surplus from industry to industry, country to country, but at a multilateral level, it doesn't matter. I think I have that right, Brad.
Yeah.
So vis-a-vis China, I'm sorry, what was the
Yeah,
question?
so my question is, do you think the 60% tariff will be possible?
So in 2017, Chinese imports into the United States as a percentage of our total imports peaked at a little bit above 21%. In 2024, they were about 13%. And so Chinese, while our total trade deficit has gone up enormously, the share from China has gone down. And I suspect that both parties approve of that. I suspect that both parties welcome a further decrease in China's share of our multilateral trade deficit. How far will it go down? I'm not sure. The other thing to be careful about is a lot of times what we're seeing coming in out of Vietnam, out of Mexico, out of Morocco, out of other countries are products that are contain a high percentage of Chinese components. I won't say that they're transshipped because that's a legal term implying illegality and customs avoidance. But there are many different ways that work can be done in other countries to make that perfectly legal. But if the major components are going from China to a factory in Vietnam, and it's coming in as a Vietnam import, and the Vietnamese percentage is 30%, then 70% is still a Chinese import, but indirect. In addition to that,
just to echo what you say, we saw a lot of import from Mexico, especially Mexico, as indirect import from China.
I don't know what percentage of that would be transshipped. Again, that's a legal term. And what there was substantial work done in Mexico to make that a Mexican import. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I have no doubt that China's exports globally are growing. And indeed rapidly, according to United Nations Industrial Development Organization forecast, China will go from about 33% of global manufacturing, according to the United Nations, up to 42% of global manufacturing by 2030. So that is a kind of a scary prospect for manufacturers elsewhere around the world. And in my view anyway, it underscores the fact that China's savings are far too high, China's consumption is far too low, and that there's a mismatch in supply and demand within China's domestic economy, as indeed there is within the U.S. economy, thus driving a lot of this trade and the ensuing trade tensions.
But I know you did a lot of research on that, right? You said that China's second wave of the manufacturer shock, and also I noticed you wrote in your essay that after COVID, although many people think the world is not flat anymore, but actually the trade relationship, the economic expansion, the trade is increased, but not decrease between multiple nations. So what do you think do you believe that Trump's tariff policy will really change the course of globalization? It's like more than COVID did.
So I'm going to give a complicated answer.
Can you put the mic up a little bit?
Sorry. I can actually shout if that helps. Talk into it. Yeah, usually the problem is I have a booming voice, not too soft a voice. So we're good? That good? The straightforward and simple answer is that if President Trump does what he says he is going to do, yes, I do think we're going to have something that's close to the end of the modern era of globalization. If you do 50-60% tariffs on China, standard economic analysis would say that trade between the U.S. and China, the direct part, will go to zero. If you put 25% tariffs on the entire world, or 20% tariffs on the entire world, the U.S. will import less. We'll also export less. Our trade deficit won't maybe change that much, but the volume of trade will fall. That's kind of the easy crystal ball forecast. The more complex bit is that there were an awful lot of these kinds of forecasts made after the first trade war with China, back in 2018 and 2019. Globalization was coming to an end. If you read pretty much anything that was coming out of the business press after Davos. After COVID, a very standard forecast was that supply chains had to shrink, had to compress because of the risks that had manifest themselves. What you actually see, though, in the years after COVID, is that the world's biggest trading power, China, not the United States, radically expanded its trade. Well, let me be more precise. It didn't actually import more manufacturers. Chinese imports of manufacturers have almost been unchanged since 2018. They're up on average about 15 billion a year, so not much over the last 6 years. Chinese exports of manufacturers, though, are way up well over $1 trillion, on average 150 billion a year. So there was no deglobalization after COVID, after the first round of tariffs. You can get around bilateral tariffs by shipping stuff. It's actually more to Vietnam and Taiwan and Thailand than to Mexico. Easy. You can get around bilateral tariffs. And China itself, its economy stalled with the real estate crisis. And countries with stalled economies and large manufacturing sectors try to get out of their stall by exporting more. So you see China's exports increase by about a percentage point of world GDP, which is actually a lot. You see Chinese exports rise as a share of Chinese GDP. So China itself is becoming more exposed to trade. And you see Chinese imports of manufacturers in particular continue to go down as a share of Chinese trade. So there is, in my view, actually a real underlying problem. Globally, China's exporting but not importing, at least not manufacturers, now probably not commodities. That imbalance reflects deeper imbalances in China, and many countries, not just the U.S., are taking action. Where I would push back a bit against the president is the notion that we should go to a trade war with Canada because we are concerned about trade with China.
So you think Trump should have a big trade war with China?
I think there you should have targeted trade wars with China aimed at encouraging Xi to rebalance his economy, not to rely on exports for growth. And frankly, I'm going to be probably provocative in this audience, we in the U.S. are uncomfortable being 100% dependent on China for imports of advanced manufacturers. We should be somewhat concerned. Drones are critical now for modern warfare. We've discovered that in Ukraine. We would not want to rely on China for batteries and drones. You can keep going down on that list, but we're in a world where we do not want full dependence, and we're in a world where China's share of the global manufacturing ecosystem is big enough that without some countermeasures, that is a realistic outcome. Where I would break a bit from the president is I wouldn't say that means there can be no trade.
But do you think the trade, you use tariff as a tool, is possible to reach a bargain with China, a grand bargain?
So I think that our perspectives are a little bit different, and certainly you are a much finer economist than I am. But what I would suggest is the fundamental problem is the imbalances domestically within the Chinese economy between supply and demand. And this problem is not going to be resolved until savings decline in China and the Chinese people have more confidence in their future so that they spend more. And the worst, kind of the clearest indicator of all this is per capita household consumption in China is between 40 and 50% of GDP compared to 60 and 70% of GDP in many other developing countries, or even higher in developed countries. And so with that mismatch, and it has to do with the Liudong Renko and Hukou, and it has to do with the lack of a pension system and the lack of insurance, Chinese oversave, the state banks overinvest in manufacturing, and the markets are not large enough to domestically absorb that. And until that changes, then there is going to be an urge to export to the rest of the world at very little profit. And this is, in my view anyway, the fundamental problem, and tariffs are not going to probably lead to resolving that issue at all.
So you just think that even U.S. charge even higher tariff will not change China's export growth model?
So China's, more than 50% of China's exports are to the developing world. What they're going to find very soon is that the developing world cannot absorb Chinese exports. Even Russia, a partnership without limits, has just put limits on Chinese automotive imports. They're calling it a recycling fee. But it's effectively a tax on Chinese cars.
So it's highly possible that may in the end we have 60% tariff, as Trump promised during the campaign trail. It's possible?
Of course it's possible. Why wouldn't it be possible? It was one of the 20 points of his presidential campaign.
Yeah.
Frankly, of those 20 points, it was probably one of the few which would command a bipartisan majority. So therefore, one can't rule it out. It is also legally, frankly, straightforward to continue to raise tariffs on China because the original Trump 301 case is still out there, wasn't fully settled. The deal was phase one, famous deal, greatest trade deal ever, if I remember the words of President Trump. But it was centered around China buying a lot more U.S. goods. It was a recoupling deal, actually, not a decoupling deal. American businesses were going to get more freedom to operate in China. Some longstanding concerns about electronic payments were actually, I think, resolved. And China was going to buy a lot more from the U.S. We were going to rely more on China for demand. We were going to export a lot more ag and a lot more energy and even more manufacturers to China. None of that happened. So since phase one, China clearly did not meet the purchase commitments. The remedy under phase one, as his then trade representative Bob Lighthizer constructed it, was more tariffs. It is the legally most straightforward case imaginable. So that's the reasons why you would do it. The reasons why it might not happen. Well, look, we have raised tariffs on China, actually. They're up 20%. That's not nothing. But rhetorically, President Trump has forgotten about China. All of his tweets recently have been about the Canadians. And the dastardly Canadians, their agricultural protectionism, their high tariffs. Sorry, they actually don't have high tariffs. The Europeans, good God, didn't we realize that the EU was constructed to blank, 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 the United States? There's been almost no presidential rhetoric criticizing trade with China. And there are repeated rumors that appear in the press, mostly in the Wall Street Journal, but are also circulating in pretty much any time a Chinese delegation shows up in D.C., shows up in New York, shows up in any European capital, that the Chinese are ready to do a deal. They are eager for a high-level summit. They are willing to buy more U.S. goods. They are certainly willing to invest more in the United States. And if you wanted to tell us a couple of Trump properties, we could probably arrange for someone to buy them.
So that's people diplomacy, right?
The old Ivanka trademark story. So we'll see. It is striking to me, at least, that rhetorically and actually legally now with the reciprocal tariffs, where we are set up to raise tariffs on everyone else more than we are set to raise tariffs further on China.
But China right now already have 39% tariff compared to, much, much higher compared to 2016, 2018. So I want to ask, as China is the most favored nation, since with such a high tariff, so to what extent does China still benefit from the most favored nation status in trade with U.S.?
I'm happy to answer that. So first of all, we have decided that we are no longer following the WTO rules vis-a-vis China. The WTO rules are your MFN tariffs. We are not doing MFN tariffs with China. We haven't since 2018. The Biden administration kept those tariffs, fiddled with them, and then Trump put a 20% tariff across the board. That becomes 45 on some particular goods. We are out of MFN vis-a-vis China. We're in a different world.
So no MFN anymore?
Well, for now, we're still doing MFN trade with Japan, with Europe. We're doing better than MFN mostly with Canada, except those goods which are not USMCA compliant, who knows. But on April 2nd, a reciprocal tariff, let's be clear, is not MFN. It is not WTO consistent. It is breaking our WTO commitments. We've already done that with China. The world doesn't end. Bob Lighthizer was right about that. But we are not going to be in a world where we are limited by the tariffs that were negotiated in the 1990s.
So you don't need people in Congress, you don't need Marco Rubio to revoke MFN. It's not there anymore, no longer there.
So within the Congress, there have been a number of proposals to revoke MFN. I think that legally, that's an important thing to look at and to keep our eyes on, because if MFN were revoked against China, then it would actually limit the president's ability to negotiate. And so watch that space. But I would agree with Brad completely that MFN is not, it's an abstract concept vis-a-vis U.S. China trade. The Chinese would, I think, respond as others have in saying that they remain MFN compliant with the United States because they're treating our tariffs as safeguard tariffs, which are allowed, permitted under the WTO. They're temporary tariffs permitted under the WTO. So certainly the global concept of MFN is under great stress, no doubt about that. But I think that the rest of the world is making an effort to maintain the principles of MFN, and that they would tell us that they are treating the U.S. in accordance to MFN, even though within Washington now, the MFN argument will get you nothing.
So in other words, if MFN with China will be revoked, it will not cause so much damage because damage already been made.
I worried about this a lot a year and a half ago, and indeed we commissioned a paper on this, which is very good. It's a very good paper, still useful, but tariffs, if they were, if PNTR were revoked and tariffs were 20% or 60%, or if PNTR were not revoked and tariffs were 60%, it doesn't matter. Tariffs are 60%. So in a way, I think that while the PNTR and MFN debate is, PNTR, I'm sorry, permanent normal trade relations, which allows us to provide MFN to China. But if they were revoked, I don't think there is any practical significance to that anymore, given the fact that the president has shown that he's so flexible with regard to tariffs. I think that the concept is no longer particularly useful vis-a-vis U.S.-China trade.
I'll toss in one point of full agreement and then one addition. The point of full agreement is that anything that is done by an act of Congress has additional significance because it can only be undone by an act of Congress. Mm-hmm. It enshrines a shift and makes it much harder to reverse course. That is still quite significant. It ties the hands of this president if he wants to do a deal, but it also ties the hands of future presidents. The less obvious point, and I think this is part of why China actually, at least in my judgment, has responded relatively calmly to the 20% tariffs, is that in the first term, and I think the Biden administration broadly shared this view, there was a consensus that the U.S. no longer wanted to trade on MFN terms with China. We didn't want to treat China, Germany, Europe, the UK, Japan the same. These are all countries who are members of the WTO, but who we don't have free trade agreements with. The MFN principle basically says they all get the same tariff. The U.S., I think now on a bipartisan basis, thinks that tariffs on China should be higher than tariffs on Japan, the UK, and the EU. What President Trump has put on the table, in a sense, is returning to more tariff equality. If everybody is hit with a tariff, the tariffs on China arguably become less significant unless they get increased proportionately more. And I think that the Chinese, looking at the world, say the big shift is not the greater restrictions on trade with China, which we kind of expected, and which we are better at getting around than most. The big change is the possibility that the initial trade wars will be with America's traditional allies.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Just I want to mention that during this environment, many multinational companies, the big companies, which your members, it's like they have this China Plus One.
Former members, I think.
Former members.
Just trying to help Craig out here. So,
They have this China Plus One strategy to move some supply chain out of China. But now it seems anything but China. Even China Plus One changed to some more mindset that anything but China. Do you notice that?
So
They just want to avoid China once for all.
for American companies, this is a very difficult time trying to anticipate next steps. I think for American and indeed European and Japanese companies in China, actually it's not that different. It's really quite similar. I think that those, and maybe we could talk about three buckets of companies. The first bucket would be those who do a lot of trading back and forth. Clearly, they have had to go to a China Plus One, or they've had to reconfigure their supply chains if they're importing consumer goods or industrial goods or whatever. And people have been doing that. As I noted, Chinese imports down from 21% of our total down to 13%, and I suspect that that'll go down this year as well. The second bucket is those who are in China for China. And many of them had imported a lot of parts, components, whatever, from the United States to put into their supply chain in China and then sell within China. That they have had to, many of them have had to deepen their integration within the Chinese ecosystem so that they are no longer importing as much from the United States because of the retaliatory tariffs or the threat of retaliatory tariffs. So ironically, and Brad made this point, which I think is profoundly important, tariffs on imports also reduce your exports. And it's counterintuitive, but it's extremely important to get that. The third bucket is American companies who are in China for Asia. Asia is integrating as an economy very rapidly, be it through the regional cooperation, RCEP, Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, which is zero tariffs in all of Asia. And so Asia is dynamic, Asia's GDP is increasing. Many American companies are in China to export to Japan or Malaysia or Australia, New Zealand, whatever. So you find Asia really becoming an economic bloc, and to be able to partake in Asian economic growth, which is by far the strongest growth in the world, you need to invest. It's harder to do that through trade. So you could sell to Japan or Australia, and in some cases we have free trade agreements, and then sell into developing Asia. But we have to remember Chinese economic growth is strong, right? And I don't know, I would defer to Brad on the numbers, but according to Premier Li Chang, China contributed 30% of global economic growth last year. I find that credible. And American companies want to take advantage of that growth. It is becoming more difficult. And companies are being pushed from participating in that growth through trade to participating in that growth through investment. And that is not a good thing, I don't think, for the American worker or for the American economy, but I think that the uncertainty of the trade policy environment is driving
But how about
outbound investment more than we would prefer.
how about to the companies as Apple, the big company as big as Apple? You know, they still have large labor force, large production line in China. So for those kind of multinationals, will they still keep the supply chain heavily in China?
Just wrote an article.
Yeah.
So I actually think Apple is a useful and instructive example. Most valuable, I think, U.S. company. Until very recently, they didn't actually have a China plus one strategy. They had a China plus Ireland strategy. China for production, Ireland for tax avoidance. Now they have a China, a little bit of India as a tiny tariff hedge, a little bit of let's buy some stuff from TSMC in Arizona as a Taiwan Straits hedge, because to be fair, they were very reliant on TSMC for their chips. So they were kind of China for production, Taiwan for semiconductors, Ireland for tax, US and Europe for sales. They've actually were the one company that almost got out entirely from the first Trump tariffs. Phones were excluded. So they are now the company that is going to pay the most of the 20% new tariff. They can, to a degree, meet European demand from China and American demand from India. But I think it's unclear if they can fully meet American demand from India. And they are very vulnerable if Europe ends up, and they probably won't, following the US, because they don't have enough production outside of China. And if you look at the details of Apple's supply chain, setting the chips aside, or actually setting the high-end chips aside, they're actually becoming more reliant on Chinese suppliers, and their Indian assembly operations rely heavily on US parts. So they do face some profound choices. Let me mention another company, because I like being provocative and I like companies that are in the news. Tesla.
Yeah, Tesla.
They don't actually, I mean, they have an America plus China plus one strategy. They actually make more EVs in China, and they've been using China as their export base. Rather interesting strategy. They are, at least their Chinese sales, are very dependent on the goodwill of President Xi. Every company operating in China is to a degree dependent on the goodwill, at least in my view, of President Xi. And if you are so close to the president and you're having weakness in your sales outside of China, you're potentially a leverage point. So I do think there's some interesting stories amongst some of our most prominent companies. I'm going to push back, Craig, on one thing, because you said a bunch of stuff that I completely agreed with about savings and social safety nets. I wish you had said that as loudly 4 years ago. But I actually don't think China contributed much to global growth last year. Of the stated 5% growth, 1.5% came from China's exports. So that wasn't a Chinese contribution. That was China drawing on the rest of the world to offset its own weakness. A lot of the remaining growth came from investment in manufacturing, which is raising questions because the underlying demand for those manufacturers is no longer there. And I think if you look at China's domestic recovery from COVID, the general consensus would be that China is no longer leading global demand. Certainly you don't see that in the import numbers. Import volumes have been incredibly weak. The driver of the global recovery from COVID has actually been the United States, and that's what Donald doesn't like. That's why our trade deficit is going up. But right now it is not at all clear, actually, that Asia is the global growth engine, and it's certainly no longer clear that China is the global growth engine. And I think that's why people are a little worried if we shoot ourselves in the foot.
I did note that Li Cheng told us that China hit their 5% growth targets and contributed 30%. So I was just quoting the premier.
Yeah. Obviously, China is the biggest beneficiary of the globalization, which this international trade system that American built after World War II. But right now, it seems that people in the United States, especially in Midwest or Rust Belt, the manufacturer workers, who pay the big price of this globalization, these are people that vote Trump twice, to send him to the White House. Right now, we mentioned this earlier, but I want to go back to this question. President Trump wants to bring back the manufacturing job to the United States. But actually, is this viable? Because United States is dominant by technology and service. Although recently, manufacturing has a boom, but it's viable to really want to bring manufacturing job back through tariff.
Let me start by saying that the one thing you do not want to do if you're bringing manufacturing jobs back is fight a trade war with Canada, the one country with whom we have a manufacturing trade surplus. So tariffing everyone is clearly not an optimal strategy for bringing manufacturing back. I do think you need a much broader set of policy tools. I think the CHIPS Act showed promise. I think I'm a Democrat. Secret. I think some of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives for investment in clean energy had a bit of promise. That said, I actually do think you can expand manufacturing output in the United States. Any country that runs a 4% of GDP trade and current account deficit is generating, and a lot of that is in manufacturers, is generating more demand from its own economy for manufacturers than it is producing, by definition. If the U.S. rebalanced its economy so it looked a bit more like Germany, we would have a bigger manufacturing sector. Manufacturing is
But Germany manufacturing right now has a big, it's not good. The car is not as good as before. They never embark on the digital economy. It's not a good example.
I was just in Germany. I did not detect any problems in my BMW rental, which took me very smoothly, admittedly it wasn't an EV, through the Alps into the mountains. I think there's a bit of over-exaggeration. But Germany's suffering right now. The reason why Germany's suffering is because China's eating their lunch in the manufacturing sector. Germany's going through what the U.S. went through 20 years ago, just in higher-end machinery-type industries. I do think that, if China's 30% of global manufacturing on its way to 40%, China is 15% of the global economy, and that share is actually not growing right now. So China is way overweight manufacturing, and a rebalancing would mean all of China's trading partners would see some expansion of manufacturing. It is not, I would hope, going to be sewing clothes together. But the U.S. doesn't produce many semiconductors either. That was the point of the CHIPS Act. We don't produce high-end capital goods that are inputs, high-tech goods, that rely on capital and knowledge, not on labor. We have a massive trade deficit in pharmaceuticals. That's a manufactured good.
But do you think a tariff can help achieve the goal?
Tariffs can achieve some narrow goals. Tariffs have protected, I'm going to be fair to Trump, where I agree with him and with Lighthizer. I think Lighthizer right. His China tariffs protected the U.S. auto industry from the auto shock. They have not generally brought all manufacturing back to the U.S., nor will the tariffs that Trump is thinking about putting in place bring all manufacturing back to the U.S. It is a fallacy to think putting a 25% tariff on chips is a substitute for the CHIPS Act. It doesn't work because we import electronics, we don't import chips. It is a mistake to think that a 25% tariff on pharmaceuticals is going to solve the problem of our pharmaceutical trade deficit, which is primarily with Ireland and Singapore, tax havens, and the incentives are in our own tax code. So tariffs are a part of a solution. They can protect specific sectors. They can achieve targeted goals, but they can't achieve this broader objective. And this broader objective, I fully agree with Craig, requires a bigger rebalancing. It requires the U.S. to save more, basically the U.S. government to run a smaller fiscal deficit. And wealthy Americans, myself included, and big American companies, the top 6 pharmaceutical companies, top 6, paid zero, set aside zero in U.S. corporate income tax last year. And they set aside zero in 2023. Those are the people who need to pay a bit of tax. I need to pay a bit more tax.
So you mean redistribute the wealth to help the manufacturer workers?
You need to reduce the fiscal deficit so that we aren't throwing money at the economy, which seeks to the rest of the world. And that, in my view, cannot just be done by cutting government spending. So that's the thing. China, fully agree with Craig, has to step up and deliver a social safety net, has to solve the problems with hukou, has to reduce the extraordinary high savings rate, because China cannot sustain its economy with 40% investment. That doesn't work if you're growing at 3 to 4. So we need a rebalancing. That rebalancing I do not accept the premise that the world as it is today is the only world that we can imagine or have. We could have a more balanced global economy with more high-end manufacturing in the U.S. and more consumption in China.
So you think Trump's tariff may help this happening?
So there is empirical evidence and a historic record that we could look at. In 2017, President Trump imposed tariffs under Section 232 of the U.S. Tariff Code on steel. And what that led to was a decrease in steel imports, but an increase in steel prices. The unfortunate unintended consequences of that were that for every steel worker who was helped, 80 workers who in the steel industry, be it automotive or machine tools or agriculture or construction, were hurt. So yeah, you could use tariffs to swing benefits to favored constituencies, but you cannot use tariffs, in my view, as an effective measure to increase overall employment across the economy. So at least in my view, we've experimented with this. It hasn't worked out well, and that experiment also contributed to the inflation which we saw in 2022 and 2023, which Americans were very resentful about.
Yeah, you talk about the inflation, like with this incoming tariff, the market is already very nervous. Yesterday, market go down like almost 1,000. Today, almost 500 points. So do you think, with this, the incoming tariff, there is a possibility that inflation will go up and we'll have a, recession?
I'm not going to bore you with the debate among economists about the difference between a one-time increase in the level of prices or the cost of living and ongoing price increases, i.e. inflation. But I will note that there is a debate. There is no debate, though, that the short-run impact of tariffs is an increase in the level of domestic prices. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers had, I thought, an interesting, at least, way of expressing it. He said that the tariffs that were threatened, not implemented a week ago, the 20% on China, the 25% on Canada and Mexico, 10% on oil, that was equivalent in aggregate impact, an impact on prices, impact on the economy, of a one-time increase in the price of oil of $40. So we'd be going from 70 to 110. If we do 20% tariffs across the board, and that was roughly a 20% tariff on 5% of GDP and trade. Roughly half our imports are from Canada, Mexico, and China. do that on everyone, which is arguably what may happen on April 2nd. That'd be the equivalent of doubling the price of oil, an $80 increase. Is that going to be perceived as inflation? You bet. Is that going to slow the economy? Pretty sure it will.
But will history repeat itself? We all know that in 1930s, that U.S. tariff make the Great Depression getting worse. Everyone's getting worse. So do you think history will repeat itself?
The Great Depression was caused by a bank run that was unresolved.
Yes.
It was augmented by the gold standard, and then the tariffs
play a part.
added to it.
Yeah.
We, fortunately, haven't had a banking crisis. We, fortunately, are not on the gold standard. So I don't think the analogy is perfect, but we could certainly throw the U.S. and the global economy into a downturn with this level of tariffs introduced this quickly. And the threat against Canada and Mexico of 25% by any forecast would have thrown their economies into a recession. China faces a challenge, given how much its economy is relied on exports for growth. China arguably can offset that more effectively than Canada and Mexico because it's much less reliant on the U.S., but also because it has a lot of domestic tools and levers that it could deploy to offset. But, without going to we're on the edge of a second Great Depression, I do think we are at least taking policy decisions that put us at risk of a self-inflicted recession.
Let me kind of go back to where we started. I think that the one way of explaining the reciprocal tariffs, the way that President Trump and Jameson Greer and Howard Lutnick talk about reciprocal tariffs, is to bring down the level of global tariffs. That is their expressed hope. And it may be the case that this is going to work, in which case they could be starting what could become a virtuous cycle of tariff reductions, if not across the world, then among a subset of countries. But if that doesn't work, and what we see rather is retaliation, we could start a vicious cycle that could get pretty deep pretty quickly. This is all happening much faster than certainly I anticipated. I'm hopeful that we will come out of this with a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle. But the case of China, I think Brad is completely correct, is unique. It's not a virtuous cycle that necessarily would include all of the world. And that goes to China's distorted economy and China going up by 2030 to 42% of global manufacturing, which is just unacceptable to China's major trading partners, certainly Europe and Japan. And so I don't know how we how we avoid the vicious cycle and get to the virtuous cycle, but it will be very interesting to watch this process. So I've asked all my staff to bring in sleeping bags to the office on the evening of April 1, when all of these papers are to be released. I know where I'll be able to find Brad.
Actually, you don't. I'm skiing.
Yeah.
Downhill rapidly, eh?
Yeah, Craig, I'm really like your idea of this virtuous cycle, because there is one reason that why President Trump want to have this trade war with everyone, with EU, with Canada, with Mexico, with Japan, with everyone, because in his logic, it's like right now the international trade system that America built after World War II, America may have no resource and ability to maintain this kind of system. America need to ask the counterpart to give the same market access, same tariff. Americans right now need this.
Well, I'm with Brad. I think that the possibility of reciprocal tariffs is a terrible idea and completely violative of WTO. That's simple to say. These are two opposite paradigms. And going from the WTO paradigm to the reciprocal paradigm would imply that, let's see, there are about 3,000 or 13,000 tariff items, 200 countries, so that would be 2.6 million some tariffs that American companies would have to face. This is not realistic. And it's impossible to negotiate. And so I don't know where we're going to be on April 2, but I'm going to be in my office, and I don't know if I'll be at my desk or in my sleeping bag with a cover over my head. I'm not sure which one it'll be. But these papers that will be released could indeed very much upset the Bretton Woods institutions of the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera. We've already withdrawn from the World Health Organization. I regret that deeply. I hope that for the sake of the global economy, that the WTO principles will be respected by all the contracting parties. But perhaps that might seem naive at this point.
Yeah, but right now, U.S. seems a very different leader. It seems, are we in the area of that value-based diplomacy give way toward only economic and military power matters? How do you perceive the U.S. leadership in this age?
The president has been very clear that he will run an America First foreign policy. And in terms of trade, that is very transactional, country by country, not block by block or multilateral or regional. And that is what the American people voted for, and that is probably what we're going to see.
Brad, are you worried about the United States global leadership?
Yes.
Okay, now let's open to the questions.
Most people would talk of trade surplus in the United States.
Sir?
And most people would talk of trade surplus. Hi. Most people talk of trade surplus on China having the United States, which is merchandise-wise is very true. And many people forget that the United States is the second biggest merchandise exporter in the world. We export $2-some trillion last year. China exported $3-some trillion last year. But in terms of soft exports, such as entertainment, Beyonce went to Europe and then had a few shows. $1 billion came back to the United States. And all the artists go everywhere to perform. We don't count those. Our insurance company have no match outside in this world. We're insuring everybody all over the globe. Those are soft money coming back to the United States. Banking. I was just at a breakfast with the Bank of America.
Could you keep your question like a question?
Yeah.
We are really out of time.
The thing is, when we talk of trade and trade surpluses, the definition of trade and trade surplus have to be redefined, in which how much money are you getting back softly or in hard commodity?
I don't think that the economists make that mistake. Economists will include services as part of the trade. But very clearly, many of the pronouncements that we're hearing out of USTR and Commerce in the White House today are talking only about the merchandise trade. And I think I would agree with you that that is analytically faulty, and that rather we should trust our economists who always include services. Is that not correct, Brad?
Well, I'm a bad economist. Sometimes I don't, because the dirty little secret of services trade is it's very poorly measured on a real-time basis. So for some purposes, you actually need to look at the goods trade. Even accounting all this offshore income, all the services, we still have a pretty big external deficit. It doesn't offset the goods deficit by any measure. And there are a couple of things which, got me in trouble in the U.S. government. These always got struck out when I put them into fact sheets and the like, particularly around St. Patrick's Day. But I do think they're actually significant and important. We run actually, if you look at the measured data, we run a big trade deficit in insurance. It's with Bermuda. We run a significant surplus in banking services, but our biggest export market is the British Virgin Islands and the Caymans. And our biggest market for software exports is not China, it's not Japan, it's not Germany, it's not France, it's Ireland. Our biggest market for exports of high-end business services, research and development services, which are central to modern tax shifting, is also Ireland. And in some categories where Ireland is number 2, Switzerland is number 1, Switzerland is number 2. So there's a whole bunch of services that are real. Architectural services, educational services, travel services. But there's an awful lot, if you look at the details of the services trade, which is tied to corporate tax avoidance. That pharmaceutical trade deficit that I mentioned earlier, the counterpart of that is a big surplus in R&D with Ireland. I would like to see both of those shrink. So I'm not going to give us the easy out of saying everything's okay. I don't think everything's okay. I think we have problems on services trade. I think we have too big of a goods trade deficit. I just disagree with President Trump's solution.
All right, thanks for the insights. I have a question about more on the kind of global side. What would you say the biggest lessons we learned from the U.S. sanction as a tool for maintaining international order, and what are the lessons we learned from the Russian-Ukraine war?
Want that one? Well, I think we've learned a lot of things. I think we've learned that you can freeze the reserves if you act collectively as a G7 of a major economy, Russia, without bringing the global financial system down. I think we have learned that a country that runs a large trade surplus, like Russia, can be a hard target to change their policies with sanctions alone. In part because we knew, and I think this is not something that we learned, it's something that we knew, which is that we, in the end of the day, still rely on oil and gas. Well, we don't rely on gas, but Europe still relies on gas. We rely on fossil fuel energy. And we are not willing to impose such severe sanctions that we cut ourselves off from energy, or that we raise the price of energy to a level that undermines our own economy and the economies of others around the world that import energy. So as a result, I think we learned that the sanctions that we were willing to apply were not strong enough, given Russia's pretty solid financial position, to force Russia to change policy. And so therefore we ended up in a world where the lines of any settlement, and there clearly does need to be a settlement, will probably be defined less by the sanctions, no matter how strong they were, than by trench warfare, drone warfare, electronic countermeasures, some low end, some high end, but a much more old-fashioned outcome. I don't think I would have thought that 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. I just want to ask a question about what's your view on, like, if we were to create a sovereign wealth fund, like, how would you recommend POTUS to what sort of recommendations would you give POTUS if we were to create a sovereign wealth fund based on like CI, China Investment Corp, or like the Saudis, as an example?
Well, no, I have a lot of views on this. Well, I highly recommend an article that appeared in the Financial Times in October called The Taxonomy of Sovereign Wealth Funds, written by me, which highlights that there are an enormous number of different models of sovereign wealth funds, most of which have absolutely no relevance for the United States. We do not actually have a ton of oil exports. We're basically flat. Our government doesn't collect much tax out of our oil production by choice. We give those rents to private landowners. We don't have a lot of foreign exchange reserves. We're not Singapore. We're not in the market every day intervening. We don't have to hand the excess reserves, which we don't need for intervention, liquidity management, over to a sovereign wealth fund to invest to achieve long-term returns. Thank God we don't have a government-run economy MBS pretends like he's privatizing his economy, but he has a bunch of government enterprises channeling money out of another government enterprise, Aramco, to build cities in the desert. We built Vegas in the desert, but we did it with private money, not a sovereign wealth fund. That's a better model. So in general, we don't need a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have sovereign wealth. We have sovereign debt. That said, there are models of sovereign wealth funds in countries that don't have big surpluses. We also don't have a budget surplus, if you haven't noticed. So we would have to borrow to get the money, and we have to borrow from the rest of the world. It's kind of complicated. But there are models. There's models where countries more or less take the proceeds of privatization and put it into investing in a new generation of companies. That's one model. And I think there are cases where you could imagine, and I think this is what some of my friends in the Biden administration at the end meant when they talked about a sovereign wealth fund, you could imagine how the U.S. government, as a result of some of its industrial policies, might accumulate equity stakes, and rather than selling those equity stakes, it might want to hold them and use them more creatively. Had we combined some warrants with the loan that the U.S. gave Tesla to help Tesla get going in the Obama years, we would have actually a decent nucleus of a sovereign wealth fund. It would not be beyond our capacity to put warrants on all the money we give to the chip companies, so that if those chip companies succeed with American taxpayer money, we get some of the equity upside. And certainly there are things which we now do with taxpayer money, like investing abroad to secure supply chains and critical minerals. We're having the capacity to invest in equity without treating it as 100% budget loss at the time of the investment, as the DFC now does, would be good. So that's way more detail than you wanted, but that's what I think.
The last question. The lady in red.
Hi, everyone. I have a two-part question. This first part is for you, Craig. I know that you formerly served as the U.S. ambassador to Brunei, and I'm curious what lessons you took from your time as ambassador that we can apply in the U.S. to our trade relations with China and how to improve those. And the second question is, I know during a time like the Russia-Ukraine war, China and Russia were developing digital currency as a way to evade sanctions. Are cryptocurrencies a part of our trade conversation now with China, and how are we approaching it? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Firstly, I learned that Brunei is a wonderful country and a lovely place with a very fascinating Huachao community in it. I was sent to Brunei to work on the TPP agreement, and indeed we were very close to a TPP agreement, but alas, it did not work. And that was a painful realization that that era of globalization is over. And that took me a long time to internalize. But I think that we need to internalize it because it's over, and we're in a new era. I think in terms of crypto, I'm a big skeptic here, and I would note that while the Chinese are embracing blockchain, they have forbidden really crypto, and at least in my view, I understand that, and I think it's probably a good choice. Where the U.S. government is going to go with crypto, I have no idea. Or whether it'll be a part of our sovereign wealth fund, I'd rely on Mr. Setzer here. But it doesn't strike me as a good idea. The Chinese, I think, are so nervous about crypto because of the problem or the potential problem of capital flight. If there was a mechanism to bring out capital out of China without government controls, I think that the Chinese government would be very concerned about that. And so I don't expect any changes to that policy. What will happen in the U.S. vis-a-vis crypto, I have not the foggiest idea. It would be good for sovereign wealth.
I'm a big crypto skeptic, so I've generally found it's best if I don't say much about crypto.
So that's great discussion. Let's give our speaker a big round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.